What if everything you've been told about success is only half the story? Behind every legend is a journey no one talks about. The failures, the sacrifices, the moments that almost broke them. From innovators to world changers to minds that shaped history, we break down what truly made them great. Because greatness isn't luck. This is Greatness Explained TV, where greatness is broken down. Subscribe and start thinking like the greats.
The Jeep screamed to a halt in the sand. There was no moon. The beach was black, the Atlantic invisible beyond the treeline, its sound a low and indifferent roar behind the noise of the soldiers. She could smell alcohol and gunpowder and the particular kind of electricity that moves through men who have already spent the day killing. One of them pulled a match from the breast pocket of his uniform shirt. He struck it slowly against the flap, not hurrying, because men who want to frighten you never hurry. He brought the flame toward her hair, close enough that she should have recoiled, close enough that any other person in any other moment might have broken and begged. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply looked at the flame, and then looked at the boy holding it, looked straight into his face the way a woman who has decided something permanent looks at a situation she refuses to let define her, and waited. The match burned down to his fingers and he blew it out, annoyed that it had given him nothing. In the seat next to her, another soldier grabbed her left hand and yanked a small gold ring from her finger. "You're going to die," he said. "Why are you going to die with a ring on?" Outside the Jeep, Camp Shefflin spread in the darkness. This was the military post on the edge of Monrovia, and tonight it was a place of executions. The men who had shared the adjacent cell with her had already been dragged out across the compound while she sat on the cold concrete floor listening and praying and trying to think. She had heard the gunshots, at a distance but not distant enough, and then silence. The men who were dragged out did not come back. One of them had called her name as they took him, had begged her to intercede, had reminded her that he knew her mother, and asked her to save him. "How can I save you?" she had called back through the bars. "When I cannot save myself?" Now she was in the Jeep. They had told her they were taking her to the grave site. They had told her they would bury her alive. The driver spun the vehicle in a wide, useless circle in the sand, a small cruelty, a humiliation designed to make her believe the end was a breath away, and then turned back toward the road. They drove back through the camp gates. They took her to a cell and locked it. She sat down on the concrete floor and she prayed, and she thought, and she did not stop thinking. No one who had watched her life from the outside would have predicted this night. No one reviewing her journey from the beginning, from the modest household in Monrovia, through the American universities and the government offices and the prison cells before this one, would have placed their money on her survival, let alone on what came after. Because the woman sitting in that cell in November 1985, surrounded by soldiers still lit up from killing, with a sedition charge on her name and the direct order to bring her before the most brutal dictator in the country already in motion, that woman had decades left to live. Decades of work. Decades of refusal. And one more election she had not yet run. She was not finished. She was just getting started. Stop for a moment and think about what you believe is permanently beyond your reach. Think about the ceiling above your own life. The one constructed from who you were born to, what country gave you its particular limitations, what decade assigned you your gender and its attendant restrictions, what room decided early that you were not the sort of person who changes things. Think about the times you were told, directly or by implication, that your window had closed, that you were too marked by your past, that other people, younger, better connected, born into the right room, had already claimed the territory you were trying to reach. Now consider what it would mean to dismantle every single one of those walls simultaneously. To do it not in your 30s, when ambition still burns clean, but in your late 60s. To do it not in a country of functioning institutions, but in a country that had just finished tearing itself apart across 15 years of civil war. To do it while being a woman on a continent where, in the entire recorded span of human history, no woman had ever been democratically elected to lead a nation. That is not a thought experiment. That is precisely what happened on January 16, 2006, in Monrovia, Liberia, when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf placed her hand on the Bible, spoke the oath of office, and became Africa's first democratically elected female head of state. But the story of how she got there is not a story about triumph. It is a story about 40 years of refusal. Refusal to be silenced by governments that jailed her. Refusal to be diminished by a marriage that tried to erase her. Refusal to be made irrelevant by the accumulating weight of exile, failure, and the repeated election of other people. Refusal to die when powerful men decided it was time. By the time this story ends, you will understand why her life matters to you today, in this moment, in whatever country you inhabit and whatever ceiling you are still measuring the distance to. Because the life of this woman contains a truth so stubbornly demonstrated across so many decades that you will not be able to sit with it quietly when this video closes. We are going to go all the way through. Stay until the end. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do that now. We are building something here, and you do not want to come in late. To understand what Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became, you have to first understand the country that made her, because Liberia is not like any other place on earth. In the early decades of the 19th century, American abolitionists and pragmatists and racial anxious men of various motivations hatched a plan. They would take black Americans, freed slaves, freeborn black citizens, people whose very presence in the United States caused discomfort to a population that said all men were created equal and meant it about a narrower population than the words suggested, and send them to Africa. Back to Africa. As if Africa were a return address stamped on a people who had been in America for 2 centuries and were more American than anything else. Thomas Jefferson himself advocated it. He authored the Declaration of Independence and owned slaves and believed with apparent sincerity that the two positions could be reconciled by shipping the problem across an ocean. The result was the American Colonization Society, and the result of that was Liberia. The first settlers arrived in 1820, and they came carrying the full cultural architecture of the American South, the language, the dress, the religion, the architecture, and the deep instinct of a people whose identity had been formed in America and who were now being told that identity should find a home in Africa. They arrived on a coastline populated by 16 indigenous ethnic groups: the Gola, the Capella, the Bassa, the Geo, the Mano, the Kron, the Grebo, the Vai, and others, each with its own governance systems, traditions, languages, and centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to live on this particular land. These worlds collided. They fused and refused to fuse simultaneously. They produced a country whose original motto, "The love of liberty brought us here," sat in profound, unresolved tension with the reality that the people who brought it had installed themselves as a ruling class above the indigenous majority and would hold that position for more than a century. It was into this paradox, in the capital city of Monrovia, on October 29, 1938, that Ellen Johnson was born. Her father's father was Jamali the Peacemaker, a Gola chief of considerable renown in Bomi County who had spent his life walking between the forest villages of the indigenous interior and the settler capital on the coast. He had learned the languages of the tribes along his routes, learned to negotiate disputes, and built the kind of cross-cultural credibility that earned him visits from presidents. His son, Ellen's father, Carney Johnson, was sent as a boy from the village to the city, entering the ward system that was Liberia's particular version of an old African institution adapted to settler needs, in which indigenous children were taken into settler homes. The family that took him gave him their tradition, a Western name to replace his own, a solid primary education, and entry into a world that would otherwise have been closed. He used every inch of it. He apprenticed to a lawyer, became a poor man's attorney, which in Liberia meant a very busy man's attorney, married, entered politics, and was climbing the ladder of the Liberian legislature with real purpose when a stroke cut him down in the prime of his ambition and left the household without its rising center of gravity. Ellen's mother, Martha Cecilia, carried a different thread of the same complicated cloth. She was the daughter of a German trader who had loved a Liberian market woman from Sino County and then vanished when the First World War forced all German nationals out of the country, leaving behind a fair-skinned child and a mother who was too poor to give her all of what she deserved. A settler family took young Martha in, first treating her appallingly, as little more than domestic labor, sleeping on tables and sometimes beneath them with the animals. But word got out about this mistreatment, and a prominent woman named Cecilia Dunbar, from one of Liberia's oldest settler families, intervened. "Give her to me," she said, and meant it. Martha became, effectively, an only child of a prosperous home, received the best available Liberian education, even spent time studying abroad, and became the kind of woman who carries herself with the composed certainty of someone who was loved well after a period of being treated as though she did not matter. When Carney Johnson walked past the Dunbar house and spotted Martha in the yard, he stopped moving. It took years of patient attention before she allowed him close enough to court her. But she did, eventually, say yes. And the couple they made, a son of a Gola chief and a daughter of a West African market woman and a German trader, both of them shaped by the ward system and its ambiguous gifts, both of them reaching hard toward something better, was the soil from which Ellen grew. A few days after Ellen was born, a wise old man came to the house to offer his good wishes, as was the custom. Her mother brought him into the room. He looked at the new baby for a long moment, then turned to Martha with a strange expression and said, "This child shall be great. This child is going to lead." Martha and her daughters would laugh about this for years. They would laugh most bitterly at the moments when greatness felt furthest away, when Ellen was trapped in a failing marriage at 17, when soldiers came to the yard with guns, when she was making her way home from prison, when she was plotting a way out of a country that kept trying to kill her ambitions along with everything else. "Where's all this greatness now?" Martha would ask, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, always praying. The Monrovia of Ellen's childhood was a particular and beloved kind of small. Zinc houses on hilly dirt streets. Papaya trees and flowering gardens and wooden outhouses. No streetlights, no telephones, no public transport. Everyone walked everywhere, to school, to church, to neighbors' houses, to the market, to the church again because church was the social architecture around which everything else arranged itself. It was, in Ellen's own later words, more large village than city. But it was home. And home, for a child with a mind like hers, was also a place to ask questions. Why did the settler elite live the way they did while indigenous people remained locked out? Why did Liberian schoolbooks teach children to admire the settler founders while the history of the Gola and the Capella and the Mano was treated as prehistory, as though the country began only when the ships arrived? Why did a land built in the name of liberty have so little of it distributed to the people in its soil? She was not yet asking these questions in political language. She was asking them in the way children ask questions, by noticing, by absorbing, by filing away what does not fit the story she is being told. She was bright, unmistakably so. She attended the College of West Africa, one of Liberia's finest secondary schools, and the excellence of her mind showed itself early enough to mark her. But at 17 she married. His name was James Sirleaf, and what drew her to him at 17 was not what she found him to be in the years that followed. He was abusive, physically, emotionally, in the ways that erosion works, wearing down the shape of a person until they can no longer quite remember what shape they were before. She had 4 sons in that house. She watched her friends leave for study abroad while she stayed in Monrovia with young children and an increasingly dark domestic situation. She looked at the life in front of her and made the most important early decision of her life. She would not remain in it. That decision required courage of a very specific kind. In the Liberia of the early 1960s, divorce was not simple for a woman. It meant social scrutiny. It meant managing the narrative. It meant being willing to look the structure that was supposed to protect you in the eye and say it is not protecting me, and I am leaving anyway. She did all of that. She divorced James Sirleaf, kept his name because it had by then become professionally attached to everything she was building, and turned herself toward the future with the absolute focus of a person who has stopped tolerating the wrong direction. She enrolled where she could. She studied accounting and economics through programs available in Liberia and abroad. She took jobs in the Treasury Department, where she discovered that she had a formidable talent for the machinery of finance, not just the numbers, but the power relationships embedded in them, the political architecture of who got what and how and why and at whose expense. She climbed, methodically and relentlessly, through increasingly senior roles. She earned a scholarship and went to the United States. She spent a summer at the Economics Institute in Boulder, Colorado, preparing for graduate training. Then she went to Harvard. And there, in the book stacks of one of the world's great universities, something irreversible happened to her understanding of the world she had come from. She learned, for the first time in any real sense, the history that her Liberian education had withheld from her. She discovered the great empires of West Africa, the Songhai, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, which had flourished for centuries before the first settler ships arrived and whose achievements had been systematically edited out of the curriculum that shaped her generation. She read the scholars who had studied Liberian political life without the varnish of official self-congratulation, who wrote plainly about the colonial relationship the settler class maintained over the indigenous majority while calling it governance. She read J. Gus Libano, who argued that political power in Liberia was not just concentrated but deliberately and structurally perpetuated, that you could not succeed in any domain of Liberian life without political connection, because those without political connection were not merely disadvantaged but actively suppressed. She emerged from Harvard with a master's degree in public administration, a diagnosis of Liberia's systemic failures so precise it could serve as a map, and the kind of outspokenness that is the natural result of understanding things clearly. She came home and went to work. In 1969, invited to speak at an economic conference in Monrovia at which she was, by any standard seniority measure, too junior to be on the program, she stood at the podium in front of government ministers, international economists, and the ambient surveillance of a regime that did not enjoy frank assessment of itself, and she gave the most honest speech anyone in that hall had probably heard in years. She talked about declining revenues and government waste and corruption and what she was willing to call, using a word she had absorbed from her reading, kleptocracy, government by theft. She talked about payroll padding and the outright stealing of public funds. She talked about the gap between what Liberia's resources should have produced for its people and what they actually received. The ripples through the conference hall, she would later recall, were palpable. Afterward, the Harvard economist who had helped arrange her opportunity found her in the hallway and took her arm. "Wonderful speech," he said. "I do, however, have some concern about your immediate future." He suggested she leave Liberia as soon as possible. He offered to get her into Harvard's Mason Fellows program. She laughed off the risk. She was a woman, after all, and in Liberia women were not jailed for simply speaking out. She believed that. She was wrong. But not yet. She returned. She rose through the Ministry of Finance to the position of assistant minister. She was rigorous and demanding and impossible to corrupt, which made her invaluable to people who wanted those qualities in a finance ministry and threatening to people who had grown comfortable with the alternative. In 1972, she delivered another major speech, this one quoting extensively from Libano's analysis of Liberian political power, and this time the regime of President William Tolbert moved against her. She was arrested and briefly imprisoned, the first of what would become a pattern so recurring it became almost biographical. She was released, unbowed. She remained in government positions, then resigned when the contradictions between her integrity and the demands of the administration she served became irreconcilable. She took senior roles at international banks and development institutions and kept building an international reputation while Liberia moved, slowly and inevitably, toward the precipice on which its history had been poised for generations. On April 12, 1980, the precipice collapsed. Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, 28 years old, led 17 soldiers into the executive mansion and killed President Tolbert. It was the first military coup in Liberia's history. For the first time since the country's founding, power had shifted from the settler class to an indigenous man. People in the streets of Monrovia celebrated, because whatever Tolbert had been, and he had been complicated, a man who made genuine reformist gestures while maintaining the essential architecture of privilege, he had not been loved, and the men who had been locked out for generations experienced the coup as a liberation. Ellen was abroad when it happened. She watched from the outside. She assessed the new situation with the same clinical precision she brought to everything else and reached a complicated conclusion. Doe was not a Democrat and was not going to become one, but the chaos of transition created spaces in which expertise could be useful. She returned. She took a position leading the Liberian Bank for Development and Investment, bringing her formidable professional training to the work of an economy in the hands of men who had military instincts and no financial ones. It did not last. Dou's government was a gathering storm. Corruption bloomed on a scale that made the Tolbert years look almost restrained. The military's reach extended into domains where it had no business and used violence where dialogue was called for. Dou's tolerance for dissent was essentially zero, and his definition of dissent was essentially anything that questioned him. In 1980, Ellen stood up at another conference and said what she thought. This time there was less patience on the other side. She was arrested again. The international community raised its voice. She was released. She left for positions abroad, Washington, Nairobi, Citibank, the UNDP, building her international credibility in the years while Liberia got darker. She returned in 1985 because she could not stay away from her country forever. Dou was staging elections, or staging the appearance of elections, and a Senate seat in Montserrado County was there to be contested. She ran. She won her seat, and then watched Dou steal the presidential election with a brazenness so complete it was almost audacious. She refused to take the seat she had legitimately won, because to do so would be to lend legitimacy to the fraudulent presidential result. The American State Department urged her to reconsider. Just get on board, they said. Trust us. Everything will be fine. She refused. Then came the night of November 12, 1985, and everything that followed it. The attempted coup of that night, led by Thomas Kwankpa, former army commander turned exile who had crossed in from Sierra Leone, lasted one morning and part of an afternoon. The announcement that it had succeeded set Monrovia dancing. The second announcement, in a different voice, set Monrovia fleeing. Dou was alive. His forces were moving. The retribution had already begun. Ellen heard both announcements. She tried to make herself invisible, visiting a recently bereaved family so she would have an explanation for being on the streets if soldiers stopped her. She almost made it home safely. She did not quite make it. When the jeep came roaring into her mother's yard in the late afternoon, soldiers drunk and shooting into the air, she knew instantly what it was. She understood that if she did not go outside and give herself to them, they would come inside shooting, and Martha, who was already on her knees in prayer in the living room, would be caught in whatever happened next. The thought of her praying mother and those particular soldiers in the same room together was the thought that moved her feet. She walked outside. She told the soldiers she knew they had come for her. She asked them to leave her mother alone. She said she would go with them if they did. They said, "Get in the jeep." She got in. What followed was one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of controlled courage in modern African political history. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, in the back of a military jeep surrounded by armed and volatile men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill, somehow turned the situation into one in which the only person keeping her head was her. While they drove, she told them she did not know where the second person they were looking for lived, a lie that may have saved that man's life, and that bought her time, because the soldiers were not prepared to return to their superiors with the job only half done. They drove around the city looking for a man she had no intention of helping them find. At a gas station at the edge of Monrovia, a second jeep intercepted them. A senior officer demanded the prisoner. She was transferred. They drove toward Camp Shefflin. During the drive, the taunting began, the match near the hair, the ring torn from her finger, the threats of what the grave site near the beach would look like. She did not panic. She did not beg. She kept talking. She kept looking at the faces of the soldiers the way a person looks at a human being they have decided not to stop believing in. She kept asking them to think about their mothers. At Camp Shefflin, she was put in a cell. The men in the adjacent cell were taken out and shot. She sat in the dark and she prayed and she kept her mind moving because the alternative was to let fear take over, and she had made a decision, somewhere in the architecture of her character, that she would not do that. Near midnight, a soldier came and opened the gate of her cell. She rose to her feet. She did not know what she would do, only that she would do something. A voice behind the soldier said, "As you were." He dropped his hands. A different soldier came forward. He was slightly older than the boys who had been taunting her, more angular, with beautiful dark skin and a very serious face. He asked if she was Gola. She said yes. He asked her to say something in the language. She offered the few words her grandmother had given her, a greeting, an expression of thanks. He looked at her for a very long time. "Okay," he said. "I will stay here all night. Nobody will trouble you." He stayed. Nobody did. The next morning they came to take her before Doe. She had managed, through everything, to remain calm. But this, she said later, was the first moment in the entire ordeal that she was genuinely, deeply afraid. Because she understood that to stand before Samuel Doe was to be one verbal exchange away from a final order. She was not dealing with young soldiers who could be reached. She was dealing with the source. But a colonel at the executive mansion looked at her, then at the arresting officer, and said with quiet authority, "Don't take her to the president. You know what will happen if you do." He had her taken instead to the Barclay Training Center. He sent word with the soldiers, not to harm her. Just prison. On his command. A stranger, a man who owed her nothing and who served a regime that wanted her gone, had just saved her life. She would find him years later and thank him. She found General Wright the same way, and Lieutenant Harris, who on the morning of her release, 9 months later, pressed into her hand the small gold ring that had been stolen from her finger on that first terrible night. He had kept it all that time. She looked at it in her hand and said his name, and he corrected her. "Colonel Harris, please," he said and smiled. 9 months in prison. A sedition charge that carried the death penalty. An international outcry that built slowly and then became irresistible. Amnesty International, the international press, American politicians growing uncomfortable with a regime that was becoming too obviously brutal for Cold War partnership calculus to justify. In July 1986, Samuel Doe issued what he called a pardon. She was released. On the morning of her release, when soldiers arrived and told her she should ride in the front of the truck while the male prisoners rode in the back, she declined. She had shared the same cell and the same sentence as those men. She would ride in the back with them. The truck moved through streets lined with people who had been waiting for exactly this. Ellen stood in the back with the other prisoners and raised her fist. Someone brought a table out and she climbed on it. "Freedom!" she cried. The crowd roared it back. In that moment, broken out of prison by the voice of people who loved the idea of her stubborn survival, she understood something important. She was not just a person fighting for herself. She had become, whether she chose it or not, the representation of something larger than herself. She would carry that weight into everything that came next. What came next was the long darkness. She went back to international positions, in Washington, in Nairobi, eventually at the United Nations Development Program, where she served as head of the Africa Bureau and then worked on a range of development initiatives across the continent. She lived in Abidjan. She lived in New York. She lived in the peculiar suspended state of the political exile, which is not absence but a kind of forced distance, close enough to see what is happening in your country, not close enough to stop it. What was happening in Liberia in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a civil war so long and so devastating that describing it numerically, 250,000 dead, 1 million displaced, a country's entire infrastructure reduced to ruin, does not quite convey what it actually meant, which was the methodical destruction of ordinary life on a scale that left no family untouched and no institution standing. The war began in 1989, when a former government official named Charles Taylor crossed into Liberia from Côte d'Ivoire at the head of a small guerrilla force with a talent for atrocity and an extraordinary gift for self-promotion. He fought Doe, who was eventually captured and killed by a rival faction in 1990. He fought the various other armed factions that the chaos of war produces. He used child soldiers. He used rape as a weapon. He traded diamonds for weapons with the Revolutionary United Front in Sierra Leone, funding their particular campaign of terror, which included the systematic amputation of civilians' limbs, in exchange for the stones that paid for his guns. He ran for president in 1997, in elections held in the exhausted aftermath of a formal peace agreement, and won with 75% of the vote because the alternative on offer was resumed war and the country had already paid every price it could pay. Ellen ran in those 1997 elections and came in second. She had a fraction of Taylor's resources, none of his intimidating power, and a reputation that the international community respected and the Liberian public associated with honesty, which in the aftermath of war can be a complicated thing. She accepted the result without bitterness and did not disappear. She kept working. From her base in Abidjan, she organized the political opposition to Taylor, cultivated relationships with heads of state across the region, built coalitions at the African Union and the United Nations, and contributed to the sustained international pressure campaign that eventually made Taylor's position untenable. She worked on debt relief frameworks. She chaired the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. She attended every peace negotiation, contributed to every policy conversation, and refused, year after year, to stop being present in the room where decisions were made. Taylor, who understood exactly what she represented, tried to link her to rebel groups and threatened to have her arrested. She challenged him publicly to produce evidence and called him what the record showed him to be. She stayed outside the country when it was unsafe to return, and she kept working. In 2003, the accumulated pressure of rebel advances, international sanctions, and the indictment of Taylor by the Special Court for Sierra Leone finally broke the stalemate. Taylor resigned and flew to Nigeria in exile. A transitional government was formed. Elections were scheduled for 2005. She decided she would run again. No one believed she would win. The conventional wisdom was so settled it had stopped being analyzed and started being assumed. She was 67 years old. She was associated, by rumor and by the visible complexity of her family's history, with the settler class that a large portion of the electorate had spent decades resenting. She had lost before. She had political opponents from every faction of Liberian political life. She had almost no money compared to her primary rival, George Weah, the global football icon, former FIFA World Player of the Year, beloved across the continent as the first African player to receive that honor, young and charismatic and capable of drawing crowds that stopped traffic. Even the United States ambassador questioned her out loud. Didn't Liberia need a fresh face? A younger energy? Wasn't it time for someone who hadn't been part of everything that went wrong to have a chance at making things right? She looked at the ambassador and told him exactly what she thought about that analysis. Then she went to work. She campaigned in every county of a country that had been destroyed and was trying to remember what it had been before the destruction. She walked the red clay roads. She sat with women who had survived things that do not have adequate names and who needed to believe that what they survived could produce something other than more of the same. She talked about fiscal policy and institutional accountability and debt cancellation, not as abstractions but as the practical mechanisms through which a country either works or doesn't. She talked about education for girls in a country where traditional practice had long directed scarce family resources toward sons. She talked about governance and transparency and the rule of law with the authority of someone who had spent decades both inside and outside the system she was describing. The first round of the November 2005 elections gave George Weah the lead with 28% of the vote, short of the majority needed for outright victory. Ellen came in second with 19%. There would be a runoff in November. And in the runoff, something happened that the conventional wisdom had not anticipated. Liberia's women organized. They mobilized across tribal and regional lines in a way that had no precedent. They voted. They brought other people to vote. They understood, with the clarity of people who had spent 15 years paying the price of other people's conflicts, what it might mean to have a different kind of leadership. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf won the runoff with 59% of the vote. On January 16, 2006, Monrovia wore the kind of sunshine that makes a city look like itself on its best day. Heads of state from across the continent had come. Laura Bush was there. Condoleezza Rice was there. The woman who would win the Nobel Peace Prize 5 years later was there, in a white dress and the accumulated weight of everything she had survived, standing before the Capitol grounds of a country that had never held an inauguration there before, always at the executive mansion, but she had chosen this place because it was the people's ground, and this inauguration belonged to the people, and speaking words that nobody in that audience was going to forget quickly. She acknowledged the suffering. She named it specifically, the civil conflict, the deaths, the displacement. She referenced, without bitterness, the confinement and the terror and the exile she herself had known. She thanked the men who had defied orders to keep her alive. She made specific, serious, accountable promises: free primary education, institutional reform, debt cancellation, restored electricity, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She said Liberia would not go back. And then she governed. She governed for 12 years across 2 full terms. She secured the cancellation of $4.5 billion of foreign debt, one of the most significant debt relief achievements in African history, freeing up resources for a government that had previously been spending the majority of its revenue on servicing obligations from decades-old loans. She restored electricity to parts of Monrovia that had not had it in 15 years. She expanded primary school enrollment by 40% in her first year alone, with particular emphasis on girls who had historically been pushed out of the education system by poverty and convention. She led Liberia through the prosecution and conviction of Charles Taylor at The Hague, the first sitting head of state ever convicted by an international war crimes tribunal. She navigated the 2014 Ebola crisis, the worst in recorded history, with the kind of clear-eyed crisis management that arguably prevented a regional catastrophe from becoming a global one. In 2011, the Nobel Committee awarded her its Peace Prize, sharing it with 2 other women, the Liberian peace activist Lema Bowie and the Yemeni journalist Tawakkol Karman, for their non-violent struggle for the safety of women and for women's rights to full participation in the processes that shape the societies they live in. In 2018, at the end of her constitutionally mandated second term, she transferred power peacefully to her elected successor. In a continent and a world in which the peaceful transfer of power by an incumbent is never quite as guaranteed as it is supposed to be, she simply walked out of the office she had spent decades trying to reach, handed the keys to the next person, and went home. Here is why this matters to you, wherever you are watching from right now. Liberia may feel far away. The specific details of Liberian history may not map directly onto whatever landscape you inhabit. But the principles embedded in this life reach much further than their geography. The demonstration that a woman could lead a nation, on a continent where that had never been done, was not just a gift to Liberia. It was a proof of concept available to every country in the world. Every girl born in Liberia after January 2006 grew up knowing that the highest office in her country had already been held by a woman, and that is not a symbolic fact. That is a fact that lives in imagination, and imagination is where the future is built. The research on women in governance is consistent and repeated across enough contexts to be considered settled. Countries with women in real positions of institutional power, not decorative representation, not performative inclusion, but actual decision-making authority, are measurably more peaceful, more stable, and more equitably prosperous over time. That finding is not a political opinion. It is an empirical pattern. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's 12-year presidency was 12 years of lived evidence for that pattern. The work she did on debt, on transparency, on institutional accountability, the dry, technical, unglamorous work of building the machinery through which a society either functions or collapses, is the work that determines whether the institutions of any country, including yours, are trustworthy or not. Every conversation happening anywhere right now about whether public money is being used for public benefit, about whether elections are free and fair, about whether the leaders governing your life are accountable to the people they govern, that conversation has a lineage. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf stood at the front of that lineage for decades, often at enormous personal cost. And the ideas she spent her life insisting upon are the same ideas your own society either embodies or is trying to reach. Her life is not history. It is ongoing argument in the world you live in. But the deepest thing this life is saying has nothing to do with Africa or governance or the Nobel Prize. It has to do with you. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was 17 years old when she first understood that her life was not what she wanted it to be. She was a young woman in a difficult marriage in a constrained country, watching the horizon of possibility move away from her. She was in her 30s when she first went to prison. She was nearly 50 when soldiers drove her to a beach in the dark and told her that was where the grave was. She ran for president twice and lost. She spent years in exile. She was rejected by her own country, passed over at the negotiating table when she received the most votes, told by the powerful to stand aside and let younger, fresher faces lead. She was 67 years old when she won. 67. There is a temptation in stories about people who accomplish extraordinary things to make the arc look inevitable from the beginning. To tell it as though the old man's prophecy over her crib was a guarantee rather than a possibility, as though the whole weight of the story was always pressing toward the moment she took the oath of office, as though the destination was visible from the starting point if you just knew where to look. But it was not. At nearly every stage of her life, the most reasonable interpretation of available evidence was that the doors were closing permanently, that she had used up her chances, that the moment had passed. She made her decision to keep going, to stay present, to remain an argument in the world even when the world was not ready to resolve the argument in her favor, not because she could see the outcome but because she refused to stop moving toward it. The question her life puts to you is not a comfortable one. What have you told yourself is permanently over? Not what you've tried and found locked, what you've stopped trying for because too many other things went wrong, because the failure of one thing convinced you the next thing would also fail, because the weight of accumulated difficulty finally became heavier than the vision that was meant to carry you through it. What version of your calling, your purpose, your unfinished work, the thing that keeps returning to your mind even when you try to put it down, have you filed away under the heading of not realistic anymore and stopped retrieving? The old man who looked at the baby in that Monrovia bedroom and made his prediction did not know what the journey would cost. He only knew what the arrival would mean. You do not yet know what your arrival will mean. But the time between now and then is being spent whether you spend it moving or not. The question is only whether you are spending it toward something. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf bled. She doubted. She laughed bitterly at the prophecy over her own life. She sat on concrete floors in the dark and prayed and thought and kept thinking. She buried friends and colleagues who did not survive the time she survived. She watched her country burn and rebuild and burn again and kept coming back to it. She got in the Jeep when the soldiers told her to, not because she wanted to but because the alternative was to let them hurt her mother. She talked to the pump when the soldiers told her to talk to the pump, because in that moment it was the right thing to do to stay alive long enough to matter. She did all of that. And then she became the first woman to lead an African nation in democratic elections. The lesson is not that everything works out. The lesson is not that if you just persist long enough, the prophecy will come true. The lesson is something harder and more honest than that the persistence itself is the point. That the refusal to stop is the act of faith that keeps the possibility alive until the moment comes when it can be walked through. That greatness is not a gift delivered in advance. It is the destination that becomes visible only from the back of the Jeep, in the dark, when you have already decided you are still in it. What is your Jeep? What is the vehicle of the work you know you were made to do, waiting in the yard of your life for someone with enough stubbornness to get in? And what is the excuse, the real excuse, not the surface one, for not getting in? Sit with that. Do not answer it immediately. Let the question remain open for a while, the way the most important questions have to remain open before they become honest answers. If this story moved something in you, if the life of this woman landed somewhere in you that needed it, do not let that movement stop at the edges of this screen. Share this video with someone who is standing at a closed door right now. Share it with the person in your life who has started to believe that their best chapter is behind them, that the most they can do is manage the remaining distance with whatever dignity is available. Share it with anyone who needs to see what 67 looks like when it is not finished. If you found value here, please like this video. Every like is a signal that this kind of storytelling matters, that history is not just something that happened to other people, and that the lives of the people who shaped this world still have something urgent to say to the people currently living in it. Subscribe to this channel if you are not already part of this community, because we are building something here, an archive of extraordinary lives told the way they deserve to be told, with the complexity and the darkness and the triumph all in the same frame, without apology. New episodes are coming, and you will not want to be absent. And drop your location in the comments right now. Tell us where in the world you are watching this from. Monrovia or Melbourne, Lagos or London, Atlanta or Abidjan. Let us see the geography of the audience this story has found. Let the comment section be the map of how far one woman's life has traveled. Africa will rise. It already has. She showed us how. One last thing before you go. There is a detail from the biography that deserves its own moment. When Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was released from prison in July 1986, she had been imprisoned for 9 months on a sedition charge that carried the death penalty. She had been held through the inauguration of the man who had ordered her arrested. She had watched others released before her. She had lived, for 9 months, in the knowledge that the decision about whether she lived or died resided entirely in the hands of a person who had every reason to choose death and no particular reason, except for the noise of a watching world, to choose otherwise. She was released. She climbed into the back of the truck with the other remaining political prisoners. She refused the front seat. She stood with the people she had shared the worst of it with, and when the truck moved through the crowds and someone brought a table out into the street, she climbed up on it and she raised her fist and she cried freedom into the air. And then she went home, changed her clothes, and got back to work. Not in a month. Not when the adrenaline of survival faded and the quieter, more complex work of building something durable began. She went back to work almost immediately because the thing she was building was not about her. It was about the country she refused to stop believing in, and the people in it who deserved something better than what the long parade of powerful, ungoverned men had given them. That is, in the end, the secret inside this story. The people who change the world are rarely the ones who are doing it for themselves. They are the ones who have found something outside themselves large enough to survive the moment when the personal cost becomes too high. Something that does not require them to feel good or confident or certain or unafraid in order to continue. Something that keeps them moving when moving is the last thing they feel like doing. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf found Liberia. She found the children of Liberia who needed to smile again. She found the women of Liberia who had survived everything and deserved to be governed by something other than the aftermath of that survival. She found the ordinary, unnamed, uncelebrated people of a country that kept breaking and kept being worth the repair. And she kept going back. What is your Liberia? What is the thing outside yourself that is large enough to carry you through the moments when you would rather stop? Because everyone has one, even if they have not named it yet. Even if the noise of everyday life has buried the sound of it under everything else competing for attention. Even if the accumulation of difficulty has made it easier to focus on the cost of continuing than on the cost of stopping. The cost of stopping is also real. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf knew that. It is why she never paid it.